Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another WERXFEST session. I'm your host for this one. Well, am I your host? It's an interesting question, actually, as you'll see in a second. JC, John Cosgrove, partner here at CloudWorks. And I'm joined from Lumia, one of our clients that we're working with. Very proud to be working with Lumia and the work they do in renewable energy in Australia. And the one and only Tim Stone. Tim, how does WERXFEST find you?
Very well. Thank you, mate. Thanks for the intro. Yes, Tim Stone here, everyone. I'm really pleased to be part of the discussion. We are part of the TransGrid group. So we're the organisation that connects almost all of the renewable energy projects being built across New South Wales and the ACT to the grid. So if there's a big solar farm or wind farm or battery being built out there, it's our job to get that infrastructure connected to the grid. And we've been working with you guys for a few months now on a new customer portal, which we're really excited about.
And you guys are brilliant at customer portals. I have to say, like, you do get to do all the cool stuff. You've got the cool tech. I love wind turbine tech. I think they're just some of the most beautiful machines we've ever built. Love solar, like everything about what you and the team at Lamia do. It's right up my alley, which is why I was somewhat shocked to hear that for today's session, I believe that, well, I hope the knives aren't out, but Tim is actually, he's putting me in the hot seat. There's a number of, just so happened, after SOWs had been signed, had one or two questions that he needed to put the consultant in the hot seat for. So a bit of a reverse interview today. Tim's got a whole bunch of questions for me. I don't have full control over the script, right? Which of course Tim is in no way going to take advantage of with me on camera. But hopefully answering some of these questions for Tim is going to be of help to you, the audience at home as well. So Tim, what's got you concerned about all things
Let, let's
AI?
let's go, JC. So yeah, we're building a customer portal with you, right? Somewhere where our energy infrastructure customers can come and they can track the big, long, expensive project of connecting their renewable energy to the grids. And you've convinced us to have AI be part of that, which is really exciting. But as the dude on the hook for delivering it to the business, I'm nervous. I'm not in AI. It's just a big, mysterious, magical machine to me. So, as someone who doesn't work in AI, who's on the hook to deliver something amazing to my organization, my team, and my bosses, how do I get comfortable, confident that the magic machine will magically work once we launch?
That's such a good question, Tim, and I really do thank you for it. And the perfect answer I have for it that I learned from some other salespeople during the Zoom call times of COVID is I think we really need to focus on the.
Yeah.
Did it work? Has he left? No, okay. I'm not going to be able to fake an actual timeout. I can exit stage left. No, okay. So it's a really good question. The whole big magic machine question. I spent quite a bit of time trying to do what I can to educate and to share, raise awareness about the core technology. Because I think what's happened is that we've advanced incredibly quickly. I'm always talking about that. I don't consider myself an expert, and I've been doing applied machine learning for a very long time, long before the generative models arrived. And I don't agree with some of the assertions that have kind of overnight become accepted parlance. The idea that these are systems that are inherently stochastic, that phrase really gets my back up. There are stochastic elements, absolutely, which means stochastic, if, for the people at home, it means something which is inherently random. So the rolling of a dice, the picking of a random number, these are things that typically we align with stochastic systems. They are usually the opposite of what we want to try and build with an IT system. And yet we've also been told that in order to get these amazing outcomes from these new machines, we have to kind of accept that there's an element to which they can't be controlled. Now, I obviously go, yeah, but we can't. I don't see a way where we can accept an architecture actually where we're just writing that off as a black box. And it really comes, rubber hits the road in exactly this situation, Tim, where you're right in saying that, like, okay, but now really, really, I'm going to actually implement this and roll this out. What am I doing? Am I saying hashtag not everything that Tim delivers can be trusted because generative AI can make stuff up? That's just not the reality on the ground. And so the first thing I do is to try and pull apart the system. What is actually in the big magic box? And if we look at it from the perspective of the LLMs themselves, so the large language models, before we think about the agentic systems, which really are an architecture that makes use of large language models, I feel we can do a number of things that help lower the temperature. Ahaha, that was actually a joke for what's coming next. We can actually reduce the uncertainty of how those systems are going to behave. People run to this idea of implementing guardrails and grounding the data. And these are good words. They're G words, big, strong guardrails and grounding, right? And they are very useful. But I think what actually helps is to first understand a little bit about why those things matter. The power of an LLM is largely defined in the context of business by that word context, by what it is supplied. The variability of its behavior, and indeed some of the risks that are emerging, the threats to its behavior, they all come down to what it is fed, what we call the context or the context window. The variability that arises from the actual machine itself is a function of how that particular model behaves, which increasingly for enterprise, we want to pick models that have been tuned less for creativity and more for reliability and rigor. That increasingly is what's earning support from businesses. So things like temperature setting is a technical setting for if you haven't heard it at home, it's basically the setting that introduces a degree of randomness, true randomness, into the selection of specific tokens or words coming out of the model. Now, for most of us using ChatGPT at home, we're not even aware of the fact that the thing has a warm temperature. It actually rambles a bit. That's part of what makes it attractive. If we're implementing agents and LLM style models into something like infrastructure and modeling and policy handling, we're not remotely interested in how well it can compose a meme about cats, right? So before we even get to the world of agentics, we're talking already here about some practical settings that we absolutely can assert about the reproducibility of input to output. And once we have that, we have a foundation from which to approach it, not as a big black box, but as a series of much smaller tools where if we configure each of them atomically and rigorously, what they begin to add up to, while complicated, is not as random and as uncertain as we might have previously thought at all. In fact, what we are doing routinely in these deployments is to identify what are the actual actions which are best suited to a generative model versus the actions where there's actually no point making the generative model do that. We would be better off having that as something which is just a normal program, which the generative model may action. So that to answer your question, in a bow, how do you know that the big machine will actually work? Well, the first thing is let's shrink back what we're actually going to put in control, the circle of what I can control of the LLM. That's the first thing, and realize that it's actually much smaller than we might first think. Make sure that as much critical activities that are clearly programmatic remain in the programmatic space. The second one is to realize that I have more control over it than I might have been led to realize. What I feed it matters. And this is where grounding and guardrails come in. Those are mechanisms for how we control what we feed it. And then the third thing is making sure we have choice around what type of model we use. This is why the whole BYO LLM is so powerful. A big part of how the Salesforce solutions work is so that you can ask questions like, do I get a more reliable outcome if I switch to this type of model versus that type of model? When you recognize that we can assert all of those, and those are assertable at the level of an individual prompt, right? An individual prompt, then we can have some confidence that we might wind up with very complicated chains and loops of prompts, but we have control over some fundamental elements, right? And that there are other things which, probably outside the scope of this call that then go into how do you put control systems around the bigger system, right? But what I try to get people aligned to begin with is let's take some power back first to begin with and actually inventory the level of control and why we have that control that we actually do still have. And if that does mean that we have to set some expectations with our consumers about what you're going to get from enterprise AI versus consumer AI, so be it, right? It's not going to do haikus and cat memes, right? But it is potentially going to do a lot more reliable work, particularly in areas where it's important that it adheres to existing guidelines.
Thank you, mate. You talked about feeding the machine, and the data inputs is another thing that I often think about. Like we have, I imagine, like a lot of enterprises, some quite structured data. We've got, SharePoint environments and project processes, and I imagine this thing will enjoy that. But we've also got lots of, I think, potentially quite useful unstructured stuff, right? On the OneDrive,
Yes.
on the hard drive, in the emails, maps, photos, all sorts of stuff. Is it one or the other or both? How to make the machine the most valuable for my customers and my team?
Yeah, and this is again a question that's now coming up everywhere. And I know, talking about your world in Lemire for a moment, right? The knowledge base that we are potentially considering here, we're talking about, like I said, some of the most beautiful, but some of the most complex machinery that humans ever built. We are talking about a deep technical knowledge base that is also very broad because you cover a range of different modalities for how we're generating green and renewable energy, right? And so when you consider that in particular in the context of Lemire, where you have these long projects, right? The project lifecycle is significant, multi-year. You can imagine that the document space and the knowledge space around each of these, elements of the business, which is a project moving through its life cycle, it's diverse, it's complex, it's multi-layered. And this is something that we see even in simpler environments, even in what you might think of as a simple call center environment. There's still an intricate level of detail around how knowledge is managed when you stop it just being here's the knowledge about the process and here's the knowledge about the person. When it becomes here's the knowledge about that person going through that process, that's the devil is always in the detail. That's where the complexity emerges. And I think when you talk about something like a wind farm being put in, you've got that on a whole different level. It's unfolding over multiple years with multiple different stakeholders, documents, and processes all wrapping around it. So the truth is that I actually think an overwhelming amount of the value is through what we've called unstructured. One of the things, again, to get on JC's soapbox is I think part of the problem is it's not truly unstructured. It has a structure. It's just that it has a structure that isn't as neat and simple as Excel-like tables, right? And so the challenge is for businesses as well. It's one of the things that we're thankfully I can say Lemire is I think ahead of the game a bit on this. Is that from what we can see already, the structure that you guys have to how you approach repeated patterns of project and repeated patterns of rollout is already very rigorous, as you would expect from somewhere that you're operating. But not every business has that. For many businesses, this is a realization that the structure you put into your documentation, your knowledge base, is now very literally as important as the structure that me and my colleagues would be putting into a data warehouse or to a database. Now, you don't need to code, but what you do need to do is to sit down and think about consistency, what we talk about as ontology, right? The consistent definition of that which is true, that which is known, and how it is known and how it is structured. This becomes incredibly important. The good news, though, is that I believe that's accessible to anyone in business. I believe that that is something where you don't even have to be like a formal BA. Anyone in the business can be involved in helping us make good and sensible decisions for the business about how we define things. And that ultimately then helps us repeat the structures of documents, repeat the terminology in documents. And that is how the super machine, the magic machine, as you were calling it, is most likely to then be able to understand. And the reason is because what these machines do brilliantly, particularly as their context window increases over time and they're getting larger and larger. What they do incredibly well is not just finding patterns, but they're actually trained. Part of the training process that goes into their attention mechanism cares about structure very, very deeply because of the way we as humans, particularly in the written world, we use structure to convey very important information. We use it to convey things like that which is subordinate. So dot points, right? Just structuring. Who knew? Dot points, turns out they love dot points. Feeding these machines YAML, which is basically dot point for coders, works extremely, extremely well. So the structure, the consistency with which we think about how we structure a document can have really outsized returns on how effectively large language models and agents then interact with this material. And I don't know, you tell me, like, I think one of the things I've really enjoyed about working with your team, Tim and Lemire in general, is that this part of the conversation, when we started to say, there isn't a code solution. It isn't about us necessarily, having the machine can help, but what we actually want to do is harness what you guys know is the way this should be structured, and use this as a catalyst, right, towards doing that, right? I think that has been something I haven't had a lot of pushback on. That's been something that very quickly was, welcomed and adopted. What have you thought of that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it it forces us to think about structure and data quality and our process. So I think we know if we just throw lots of random stuff at the machine, we're going to get some amount of value. But if you can tidy it up, if you can convince everyone in the business to align more around the process steps and the artifacts and the structures within that, that can really only benefit everyone, right? It'll benefit the
Exactly.
AI, but it'll also just benefit the kind of the way your business runs. We often get in our employee engagement feedback that, the number one challenge is information systems and processes. So it's
Yeah.
kind of it's returning the favor in that it's encouraging us to get better at that stuff anyway. I think the thing that it makes me think about though is where is AI on its curve of being able to absorb this stuff usefully. I've heard examples of, it's really good in a call center, a bank, retail energy, insurance inquiries. I get the feeling it's going to be quite good at reading our customer contracts and looking at our financial models. But I try to think of examples of where do I reckon it won't yet be able to help us. And I reckon something like a Google Earth AMZ of
Mm.
where all of the energy cables go and all the high voltage towers are. Surely it can't help me with that yet, right?
Yeah, that's a great example. There are absolutely models, large models that have been trained specifically to do geospatial reasoning, right? But does that mean that ChatGPT should be what you're using for geospatial reasoning? No. And I'm on record already in, some other recordings about saying I think you're crazy to replace strict geospatial engineering, like geospatial coders, with what you can get as an approximation out of things like GPT, because the value of, to your example, the type of geospatial analyses that you're doing with where you're going to place things, where plants will interoperate, is all in its precision. The value is in the precision. The geospatial location, the lat long, the more accurate that is, the more powerful the trigonometry that can be done. And all the value is the fact that we're doing trigonometry on this big sphere. So it's a perfect example there where you're going, even if I could make an LLM do this, don't, because it's the wrong application of the maths. It's a different type of maths going on over there. This is trigonometry. We've had computers that do trigonometry for some time, right? That's how you have things like Google Earth. This is going to be some of the challenge. I think this is also where some of the early, to your point about like some of the media, this is where so many things fell down. I am actually genuinely still staggered and a little terrified at how often I have walked into places with very competent, very knowledgeable developers and engineers who are learning how to use these tools and are building cool stuff, but very clearly have not yet learned the basics of how to make this distinction. So I'm talking people that build apps for a living, are still then doing things like I'm feeding an entire database table into the context window and I'm asking it to figure out what the answer to this aggregate query is. And what's incredible is that sometimes I've had these conversations with them and they don't know what they're doing wrong because the last 3 demos worked. Right. So it's remarkable that the tool is able to do any of that at all. But the reality is that's completely the wrong use case. That's what we have SQL for. That's what we have a database for. That's what we have spreadsheets for. It's the same thing with the trigonometry, is you really have to ask yourself, not, do I make it do this? Well, why? The business should be seeking to solve the particular problem in hand with the most reliable, cost-effective method possible. What I tend to see is that people go, well, if that's true, then what's the value of Gen AI? It sounds like, John, that what you're saying is you want to make as many things as possible not be done by the Gen AI. Yes, that's true, because what has been incredibly difficult are high level, very context sensitive rule systems. If what we have to do is write an orchestration system that has every conceivable permutated array of the if this then that, it becomes incredibly difficult to do it the old fashioned way. What these tools are amazing at doing is integrating all information and all instructions they've received and devising a likely sequence, a likely series of plans. And that's where all the development is now really focused with these new reasoning engines. Reasoning engines are all about increasing the fidelity with which it develops plans, tests those plans, and then revises those plans. So from that perspective, then you don't expect that the caliber of your senior engineer is whether or not they can do mental arithmetic. You expect them to pick up a calculator, right? What you care about is that they know what calculators are and that they can use one. It's kind of a similar thing here with Gen AI, is that an agent would want to know it has access to geospatial services. We can do those geospatial calculations even in things like data cloud on Salesforce. It doesn't even necessarily have to go off platform, but it wants to call the tool. What's remarkable though is that the machine will consider the problem state at hand, this moment, this customer in this process at this step, and it will say, on the balance of factors, I'd like to check that on Google Maps. And it will make the call to Google Maps and that is the value. The value is the discretion, right? People often talk about autonomy and that's the idea behind agents and agency. I talk more about discretion and I talk about delegation and the span of delegation. What we allow them to decide is more important in many ways. And actually we get the best outcomes when we're quite narrow in that span of delegation and what tools they have. It's better to have several agents, each of which are quite specialized, and give them the ability to hand off than it is to try and make one all-encompassing one, right? And then equipping those tools is just as important as our conversation before about equipping them with the right documents. And so in many ways, it's a forcing function. It's a bit of a flush through enterprise IT at the moment. It's really a quick check. Is your document slash knowledge system structured in such a way that if it suddenly had thousands of views a minute, which is how an agent will work, it would be consistent? And are your tools structured in such a way that they can be called routinely and get the result that they want back, right? And if you get it to that level, the results are then transformative when you connect them to an agent.
But JC, I don't think ours are. So should I be
Yes.
concerned?
Yeah, so and that's the question, isn't it? And I think that I think the art of digital transformation over these years has been all about recognizing that like you've got two options. You can do the big bang, and sometimes you should, right? Or you can do more the personal fitness trainer thing. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, right? Now, obviously I'm fundamentally in that camp almost all the time. I have had to make advice in the past where I've said, I actually do think you're going to have to do this big bang, but it's only where we're looking at something where it's the downside risks are overwhelming, right? Or it's really a case of this must be absolutely perfect. In most other cases, even when you have a bit of that, right? And obviously there are elements of what you guys do with infrastructure where you would say it's a very serious, thing that has to be managed. But we can fill the gap in our knowledge usually more effectively by doing than if we're trying to do it all on a whiteboard. I'm biased in favor of learning more about the context of the solution by solving some things that are in an acceptable area of risk. The second point, though, bizarrely, this technology is probably the most powerful tool we've had to do some of that cleanup.
Yeah.
If we can sort the cleanup into two buckets for a second, the chores we wish we could just outsource and the things which we haven't done because we know we have to really sit down and think about it, I'm pretty sure we can now automate most of the first bucket using LLMs. And that's what we're doing in most customers is we're going, you know what, we can unleash them on the document, corpus to begin with and let them do what they do best, which is summarize that and analyze that and help us, consider ways to refine it. If what we actually have is a question about a core step in our process and how two teams interact, well, actually, we should probably stop and solve that the old-fashioned human way. But we probably have more appetite for that than we do for all of the routine clean. So I think there's a very, I know because we've seen this with customers, that there's a bootstrap effect here. And it's also why I'm such an advocate of get started with LLM workflows before you do full-blown agentics. That it doesn't have to be by much, it can be by a couple of weeks, but really powerful agentic deployments, they make use of LLM workflows anyway. And LLM workflows often help you clean stuff up in preparation for the agentics.
Got it. Got it. Can we talk about my customers for a little while?
Hmm.
We're going to roll these tools out to my customers soon, and I'm feeling equal parts super excited and equal parts dread. I can't wait for them to get them because it's going to speed up and simplify and align the way we work with our customers. It's going to make, finding that contract, that email so much easier. I can't wait for the innovation story that will
Mm-hmm.
come off the back of it. But I also sometimes read about AI hallucination anecdotes in the industry. How do I get comfortable that my agentic AI is not going to turn into a chicken or a demagogue?
Yeah.
And how do I get my customers ready for this?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And the chicken one, I told you the other day, I have a little trick where I try to turn people's chatbots into chickens as a really quick check to see if they've got some of the basic guardrails in place. I think again, I'm going to keep coming back to half of the quite justifiable fear is because of reports of things that have happened in the field where I just look at it and go, I mean, I never want to make light of an IT disaster. That's always a terrible thing for all parties involved. But genuinely, you did not know what you were doing. Some of the things that happen, I just look at and go, we're clearly in the very early stages of the tech because this was just crazy that you let anybody near this setup, if this is what they thought good was, right? But having said that, I'm also not going to stand here and say, but anybody who tells you they already know how to make it perfectly safe, immediately be worried about them. The key paradigm shift here um, is to say clearly, I believe, we are no longer building systems with technology, with IT technology, that are in the bucket we've had where we can write a unit test. And that unit test in code will always evaluate anytime you run it to true or false. And if it evaluates true, you can be absolutely certain it's true. And if it evaluates to false, you can be absolutely certain that it's false. We're no longer in that paradigm. We've instead, time out for a second. Sorry, I've just got a bit of background noise.
Well, I couldn't hear it.
Sorry about that. I will try to come back
You're
in
right.
with my head on an angle. We're leaving this period where things were able to be coded with their own tests that gave you a very clear positive or negative outcome. And that scares everybody in the industry, everybody working with IT. But that's how every other aspect of engineering has ever had to operate ever, right? Is that it doesn't mean that what we now have is utter chaos. Not at all. It means that what we have to deal with is something called tolerances. That there's a way to engineer these that requires us, frankly, to be better at testing. I actually, coming from a science background, I actually find unit tests to be just the world's biggest cheat. It's kind of ridiculous because in every other aspect where we seek certainty from the real and material world, we have to do something thousands of times. We have to measure it carefully, and then we have to run statistics on it. And that's been good enough to get us up in planes. That's been good enough to get us driving cars, right? Can we ever say that a car is never going to have a fault, that it's impossible there will ever be an issue with a plane? No. But what we have been able to do is to move the probabilities of those errors so far to one side that people are able to conduct business within reasonable parameters, right? And reasonable levels of insurance. I think that's part of the issue. However, that can't be used as a cop out. What concerns me at the moment is people are going, so, up to 10% of the time, it could become a chicken. I'm going, that's completely unacceptable. Like what you need to be doing is building what are called evals, evaluations. And in the Gen AI industry, there's a phrase, it's kind of tongue in cheek, evals are all you need. It's kind of true that if you're designing these systems with evaluations really from the outset, like a scientist designing an experiment or an engineer designing measurement systems for tolerances, right? You actually are able very quickly to see how you're able to get that confidence. Because when we suddenly tell you, we've literally tried to derail this thing now 10,000 times, and it wasn't the same thing each time. It's like a vast array of different attempts to try and turn it into a chicken. And if we say it happened 3 times, and in those 3 times, it knew it was being a chicken, right? And then I tell you, and we even figured out in those times when it varied, the words that it used, that it only used during those times. You can see how I can take another couple of steps and start to go, so if I now introduce a simple word monitoring program, right, that isn't through an LLM, that looks for those words, and I combine that with the testing I've already done, I've now dropped the probability pretty significantly. I think the other piece then is, again, just like when designing scientific systems, we also have to categorize our failure modes, right? So becoming a chicken is embarrassing, but it's not the end of the world, right? Having it automatically delete your bank account is devastating. It's existential. When I look at those in the media, I often see them portrayed as equivalent. They say it's super easy to get an LLM to think it's something else, and now here's an example where it deleted a bank account. And I'm going, these are two completely different problems from an InfoSec perspective, because the issue is the agent should never have been granted access to the bank account. The blast radius from these systems is predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly a function of the tools we connected to it. So again, back to my point about basically separation of concerns. If you the more you try to make one agent to rule them all, the greater the risk if it has even fractional derailment. So don't do it. Having very narrow spans, each of which are uniquely tested. Can we ever get to 100% certainty? No, but we should be able to chase things like Six Sigma. And I would suggest, this is a bit prosy of me, but given that your clients are people who build substations, they build, wind turbines and solar plants, engineering tolerances are something they know really, really well, right? The real physical engineering world knows all about this. We simply have to demonstrate that we can now do a similar level. And the thing I find, nerdy about all of this is, unlike a real science experiment in the real world, I can run 10,000 evaluations in about 5 minutes because I'm just kicking off a bunch of calls, right? So it's not even like it's still that hard. We just have to develop this new muscle we don't really have in IT, which is, it's not just a unit test now. It's more of an experiment, and our job is to try and derail it. Not to simply assert that it seems to be doing what we wanted it to do. We need to assert that when I try to make it do things it didn't want to do, that it was resilient.
Nice. I like the Six Sigma analogy. I like, yeah,
Mm.
a certain tolerance for a small amount of failure is normal. Can we talk about staff? I remember a
Mm.
couple of months ago vividly when I got up in front of the team here and talked really excitedly about what we were doing with you guys in AI. You could clearly see in the room a bunch of people who were very excited about it, animated, wriggling around in their chairs. But there were a surprising amount who were very silent.
Mm.
And in talking, there's clearly those in the world who look at tools like this as great enablers. I don't know, the weaving loom, the printing press, the personal computer. We've all
Yeah.
still got jobs, right? But there are people who are concerned, right? Oh, this thing's going to replace me.
Yeah.
How do we do change management internally to bring those people along on the journey?
It, okay, this is one that I'm very passionate about. By remembering fear. Another thing, we talk about IT, right? We've been able to standardize some things and make things easy for us, in part to help us with a very high level of change. We have forgotten how to think about fear as a motivator in the context of change dynamics. It's not something we encounter. Again, it is something encountered when talking about energy production. It is outrage. All the gamut of political spectra is at play in many other domains. But in IT, we've had a tendency to not have to worry about that. We've worried about things like attention. Adoption's been driven by utility. and ease of use and friction, right? Whereas here, it is entirely reasonable to have fear. And it's not even just fear in the sense that we might normally have encountered in businesses, of change. This is potentially existential. So the first thing we must do is recognize it and be ready to immediately label it and treat it with respect. And this is something we really embrace at CloudWorks because, as you know, we're fiercely, fiercely human-centric. It's more than just a hashtag for us. We view this whole moment in technology as a testing point for the type of values that we've always carried with design. We now see how designing a system such that it has human-centric values is no longer just a path to quick adoption. It may actually be a fundamental aspect of safety for how capital S safety, for how we guide the development of these systems. So it goes hand in hand with that then we have to listen to the fear. So the first thing is remembering how to listen. There is a tendency, I'm as guilty of this as anybody, more so. There's a tendency to want to explain the technical in order to go, oh, no, 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 it doesn't quite work that way. You don't have any reason to be afraid. It's just not going to work, right? This technology, even when it's working within the tolerances we described, is fundamentally confronting, I believe. I'm confronted by it every day, you'd think I'd be used to it by now. So an essential part of this, whenever we have something of this magnitude, another thing I quote frequently is Oppenheimer, the movie. I think it was an incredibly well-timed movie with what's going on. There's this point about the relationship between fearing something and understanding something. I mean, he gave the extreme example of they had to be afraid of what it could do to fully understand why they had to engage with it. I think we're kind of having that Oppenheimer moment. Is people are waking up to like, wait a minute, this is quite significant. I welcome that. I don't want everyone to be terrified all the time, but I welcome fear as a response at some level because it tells me we can see the implication. What do we then do with that? So the first thing is you don't stop the fear conversation, you welcome it. The second thing is how do you direct it? There's an education step, but the education step isn't about explaining to them why they shouldn't be afraid. The education step is about giving them power. So the other thing that we've then always found in our change management journey is user empowerment is key. Again, here I think it becomes, capital E empowerment. This is human empowerment as their relationship with machines now begins to change. So we're seeing a lot of benefit in reminding ourselves this is actually best practice change management, but by the same token, refusing to treat it as business as usual, refusing to say it's just another change management workshop and going, no, this does need to have its own pattern. We've found it to be really helpful, where businesses have embraced this, we've seen it immediately be of benefit is where you encourage the business to have a forum for discussing the role of ethics in AI, the role of AI in the business that is deliberately cross-functional. It's not the usual suspects you might have at a governance meeting because it's not entirely a governance meeting. It's a space where that conversation can be had, and that it should have people that are from the front line as much as it has people from the executive. This goes back to my point about, even fixing the document issue. It's inherently cross-functional. This technology is easier to implement. It's better in terms of the deliverables, the actual technical deliverables. It's safer and it has a higher level of, I would say, happy adoption, or at least, embraced adoption, the more we focus on empowering the humans that are using and building it through understanding, through design, and through feedback on what they are and are not comfortable with. And I think it's the same thing here. Effectively, it's in the same way that we knew that co-design helped us create the first crop of super user advocates. Co-design here helps us create the safe environment for this technology to be trialed. We very firmly believe that, and so far the data is really definitely supporting it.
I feel like there's enough examples in our careers of technology being an absolute enabler, right? Like
Mm.
we all work with PCs and emails, using the internet. They're great enablers, and I think this should be viewed as something like that.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Let's talk about bubbles. I am sadly old enough
I
to
just
to
need
be
to
able to
sell. I just
say
need to sell some Nvidia stock. Just give me a second. No, no.
I started my career just in time for the .com, bubble and burst. And I remember, for every Facebook, there's a MySpace. For every Amazon, there's a pets.com, right? We're investing money here in schools and organizations. We don't know who's going to win. How do customers of this type of technology try to avoid the MySpaces and pick the Facebooks?
Totally. So I increasingly seem to be rehearsing this particular talk track, which
Hmm.
is fun. I'm glad this is being discussed. So I'm going to give you the absolute honest JC answer to this. First things first, why do you actually care? Like, why do you actually care? If you think about it, if we believe in what the capitalist system is designed to do, we talk about this idea of creative destruction. In all of those bubble moments, the bubble happened really for one reason. Capitalism aggregates resources where multiple enlightened parties see potential. They see potential for profit. They see potential to compete to maximize that profit. It's actually a feature, not a bug. We can think whatever we think of that politically and personally and ethically, and I can park that to one side, right? That's definitely a whiskey conversation. But the system is designed to knowingly see multiple competitors spontaneously arise, knowing they're not all going to survive. That's what causes a bubble. A bubble happens because capital's over allocated to an opportunity, and we know there's then going to be a reckoning moment. But out of those events we just talked about, with the exception of when the bubble is fueled through misdemeanor, right? I'm not talking about bubbles that are fueled because people are lying to people, but when we're talking about bubbles that have happened because of an opportunity event, out of the dot-com bubble, we got cloud and the internet. Right. There's going to be something here. So, do I feel that we're not going to see some type of market level capital consolidation? It feels like, it would be the first time in history where you didn't have something like that. But do I think that equates to, therefore, generative AI is all a sham? Absolutely, categorically not. And the reason is this: if we stopped all development today, if they never got better ever again, we've got 10 years of hard science research ahead of us just with what we've currently unlocked. We do not fully understand what we have currently unlocked. And that is mind blowing when you consider how much capital and growth has been unlocked out of putting a CRM in a cloud, right? The fact that we've cracked a form of computation, right? That is pushing the boundaries of information theory. Uh, it's not going to go away just because NVIDIA takes a hit or because we wind up losing one of the hyperscalers or one of the frontier labs as a result of competitive pressure. So that's the first thing is like, let's be clear. The technology is not a sham. The technology is not under existential threat. It's staying. So then it becomes tactical. Am I picking the right supplier? Yes, correct.
Exactly, JC. And that's the thing, right? I got a finance GM who, if I go and buy 1,000 Blackberries or Laserdisc players or something like that, to your point, that's a tactical issue. I certainly wouldn't argue that AI is going away, but am I going to back the wrong horse?
Yeah, okay. So this is where I go and have from the very beginning. This is why I'm so glad there is one decision that I swear will go on the history books. It was the decision Mark Benioff made not to enter the frontier model training race. It was the right decision. We don't need more people on that Sport of Kings burn $100 billion every 12 months on an asset, right? We've got enough people doing it. The genius was the BYO LLM posture. The fact that already, like from day one, I was able to switch in different models. That's that's where I'm interested in. What we're really talking about here is non-regrettable IT spend. So investing in things where I'm not going to regret that, regardless of what changes in the frontier. And it's a big part. There's stuff I'll be continuing to support and release. I just feel that there is so much more material that the world needs to understand about things like Agent Force on Salesforce platform, about why the design of Agentforce actually aligns to concepts that people are only just now starting to get their head around, like context engineering. I've been, just to stand on the soapbox again, I've been arguing that we shouldn't be calling it prompt engineering. We should be calling it context engineering for at least 18 months, right? Long before it was cool, because what we're calling prompt engineering is a subset of that bigger picture. Once you understand that, like I said before, you've got the things the model can do and you've got the things we feed the model, you realize that all of us as practitioners, the people not training models, we're all basically converging on obsessing about how we manage context. It's all about RAG. It's all about connecting documents. It's all about tools, right? That's all in the context space. Agentforce, back in its first iteration in the middle of last year, back in the middle of 2024, was breaking the idea of context down into constituent components and giving us a toolkit to orchestrate it, not to write it, not to hard code it, but to orchestrate it exactly like Salesforce did, many moons ago when they first created force.com. The genius was to take two steps back, not just one step back. One step back would be letting you customize your CRM. Two steps back would be to realize that the same tools could let you build any type of software potentially inside the same platform. We've got the same thing here. By taking that posture, Agentforce isn't restricting how you design agents at all. It is actually giving you a toolkit from which there is an enormous number of permutations. It's not letting you sit down and hard write code, although, as always with Salesforce, there's actually ways you can do that if you really want to. What it's actually doing is it's challenging people who think the automatic solution for IT in any business is to write code, when in my experience, overwhelmingly, it is not. Your question from the financial controller is a lot easier to answer. Usually the second question is, and do I always need JC to update it? Do I always need to pay for a consultant, right, to maintain it? If you are investing in systems that require you to literally write code, you're kind of doing that. And most of the solutions at the moment, that's kind of where you have to start. You have to hard write code. If you're investing in solutions that abstract that even a little, then what you're really doing is you're investing in kind of what we were talking about with the documents. You're investing in defining how to think about your business, how your business's architecture interacts with these systems. So all that boils down to, if you care about bubbles, if you care about whether you're backing the right horse, the correct posture is to be using a technology that has interoperability, allows rapid switching between those providers, and whose implementation layer is at some level abstracted, right? That has the ability to then redeploy or map to different solutions as those solutions evolve and iterate. And that's exactly why I'm so bullish. I still am bullish on Agentforce. Whatever happens in terms of commercials, whatever happens in terms of features, I know that at the core, we're still going to be doing this context management. We're still going to be swapping in the latest model. And they've actually got a system that's doing that at scale in a way that really none of the other players do at the moment. All the other players are biased to their in-house LLM, and it flavors everything about how they're doing that. Whereas here, we've got this amazing toolkit, which is actually agnostic.
Awesome. Thank you, mate. That's all I got.
That's it. I'm off the hook.
You're
That
off the
was
hook.
easy. That wasn't even
Well
hard.
done.
I mean, I thought, yeah, I wasn't sure what this was going to be about. That's why I've had the door open, ready to bolt at a minute's notice, like a good consultant that I am. No, those are really, really important questions, Tim. And as always, like, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you in what has really been quite a short space of time. I think we first started, I got to know you and we've been working together literally since just before Christmas. So we're only about 6, 7 months through the journey, which from the perspective of the type of timelines you guys engage in, when we're talking about the way in which we connect renewable energy to the grid, how we build things like wind farms and solar farms, that's really incredibly quick. And so I do want to just take a moment to thank you, to thank Lamia, not just for working with us, but for being as forward thinking, for leaning in, for engaging. I get really excited, as you know, I get genuinely excited about the idea that using this technology in any way to accelerate the transition to renewable is pretty much at the top of my list. And we know that this technology itself needs energy to fuel it. It's a perfect example in my book of why we should then be investing in renewable infrastructure. There's no reason for us not to use it as a really good reason to continue to perpetuate that. So it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to get to work with you guys as you do this at Lumia.
Thank you, mate. And I had not thought about the virtuous circle of the energy required to power the model.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If
Nice.
we use the technology, like I said, empowerment, there is no reason not to use this technology to accelerate transition to renewable and low carbon. And then we don't have an issue with how much energy it's consuming, so long as we are transitioning the grid to something where energy is potential without that liability. And we couldn't do it without the work you and the team do. So thank you again.
No, and thank you, mate. It's speed is of the essence in this industry, and this is going to enable us to go faster and go better. So we absolutely appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you, sir. And thank you
Thanks,
everybody
bud.
for watching. We hope that you stay tuned to WERXFEST. As you can see, we've got heaps of things going on. They're all on the poster behind me. So if you haven't already, check out the website. Make sure that you're across whatever's happening both online and potentially in a city near you. We're going to 4 of the great capitals of the country in person. So if you haven't had enough of me shouting about agents, you can find your nearest local capital city and then find us there as well. Thank you again. Thanks for the time again, Tim.